Picture a European traveler in the year 1519, standing at the edge of a city built entirely on water. Causeways stretch for miles across a lake, connecting the city to the mainland. Canals run through every district instead of streets, and thousands of canoes glide silently between them. Fresh water flows in through an aqueduct engineered specifically to keep the lake's saltwater separate from drinking water. Public restrooms line the main roads. Streets are swept clean every single day by a dedicated sanitation workforce. And the market at the city's edge is so vast, so orderly, and so busy that the same Spanish soldiers who would later help destroy this place wrote home in genuine disbelief, comparing it favorably to anything they'd seen in Rome or Constantinople. This city was Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. And in 1519, it was almost certainly bigger, cleaner, and more sophisticated than Paris.
That claim tends to stop people. It sounds like an exaggeration, or a piece of romanticized revisionism designed to make a point rather than tell the truth. It isn't. And to understand why it's true, and why so few people outside of specialized history circles actually know it, we need to look closely at what Tenochtitlan actually was, and place it honestly next to the European cities everyone assumes were more advanced. Let's start with scale, because that's where the disparity is largest, and also where historians are most careful to acknowledge genuine uncertainty. Estimating pre-modern city populations is notoriously difficult, and estimates for Tenochtitlan, at its height in the early 16th century, range fairly widely, from around 150,000 people on the conservative end to as many as 200,000 to 300,000 on the higher end, depending on the source and the methodology used. Even taking the conservative end of that range seriously, this puts Tenochtitlan comfortably ahead of Paris, which most demographic historians estimate at somewhere between 150,000 and 225,000 people around the same period. And if the higher Tenochtitlan estimates are closer to accurate, the Aztec capital wasn't just comparable to Paris, it was substantially larger, likely making it one of the largest cities on Earth at the time, rivaling or exceeding cities like Constantinople. This isn't a fringe claim cooked up to score points against European history. It's a fairly mainstream position among historians of Mesoamerica and comparative urban history, even if the exact numbers remain genuinely debated. What isn't seriously debated is the basic shape of the comparison. This was not a small regional settlement stumbled upon by surprised conquistadors. It was one of the largest, most densely populated urban centers anywhere in the world. So how did a city on a lake in the middle of a valley become this large? And how did it function at that scale, without wheels, without draft animals for hauling goods, and without iron tools? The answer lies in one of the most sophisticated pieces of hydraulic engineering constructed anywhere before the modern era. Tenochtitlan was founded, according to Aztec tradition, in 1325 on a small island in Lake Texcoco. Rather than treating the lake as an obstacle, Aztec engineers treated it as raw material. Over the following 2 centuries, the city expanded dramatically using a system called chinampas, artificial islands built up from layers of mud, decayed vegetation, and lake sediment, anchored in place by willow trees planted along their edges, whose roots gradually locked the soil together into stable, remarkably fertile farmland. This wasn't a primitive workaround. Chinampas were an extraordinarily productive agricultural system, allowing multiple harvests per year on land that had quite literally been built from scratch out of a lake. Some estimates suggest Chinampa agriculture alone could have fed a significant portion of the city's population, all within walking distance of the urban core. something almost no other major pre-modern city could claim. The lake itself created a real engineering problem. Texcoco was partially saline, and as the city grew, keeping the surrounding freshwater separate from saltwater became essential to both drinking supply and agriculture. Aztec engineers solved this with a massive dike, generally credited to the ruler Nezahualcoyotl in the 15th century, stretching for miles across the lake and physically separating a freshwater basin from the saltier waters beyond it. Alongside the dike, an aqueduct system carried fresh spring water from the hills at Chapultepec directly into the city. A dual pipe system, historians believe, that allowed one channel to be cleaned or repaired while the other remained in continuous use, ensuring the water supply was never fully interrupted. Compare this, for a moment, to European cities of the same era. Paris, in the early 16th century, had no citywide sewage system worth the name. Waste was routinely thrown directly into the streets or the Seine. The smell of major European cities during this period is a recurring, almost universal complaint in period accounts from visitors. A level of urban filth so pervasive it shaped public health for centuries. Tenochtitlan, by contrast, had an organized system of public latrines throughout the city, with human waste systematically collected, transported by canoe, and used deliberately as fertilizer for the chinampas, an early and remarkably functional form of what we'd now recognize as urban waste management and agricultural recycling. Spanish accounts from the conquest period specifically noted how clean the city's streets were, describing regular sweeping and maintenance carried out by dedicated municipal workers, a level of organized civic sanitation that simply had no equivalent in most of contemporary Europe. None of this means European cities of the period were somehow uncivilized, or that this comparison is meant to declare a simple winner in some kind of historical competition. Paris had its own extraordinary achievements. Notre Dame was already centuries old by 1519. The University of Paris was one of the intellectual centers of Europe, and European urban life had its own complex, functioning systems, adapted to very different geography and constraints. The point isn't that one civilization was simply better than the other in some flattened, universal sense. It's that the specific European assumption that indigenous American societies encountered in 1519 were somehow less developed, less organized, or less urban than European civilization at the time collapses almost immediately under direct comparison of the actual physical cities involved. Let's walk through what a visitor to Tenochtitlan would have actually experienced, because the details matter more than the population statistics alone. The city was organized into 4 main quadrants, called kampan, each further divided into kalpuli, organized neighborhood districts, each with its own local temple, administrative structure, and internal leadership, alongside a citywide governing structure centered on the massive Templo Mayor complex at the city's ceremonial heart. At the city's edge sat the great market of Tlatelolco, and this is where the accounts from Spanish eyewitnesses become almost breathless in their detail. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier who accompanied Hernán Cortés and later wrote one of the most detailed first-hand chronicles of the conquest, described the market as holding upward of 60,000 people on a single trading day, buying and selling gold, silver, feathers, cotton textiles, cacao, pottery, tools, medicinal herbs, and food of every conceivable variety, organized into distinct sections by product type, with designated officials specifically assigned to walk the market and settle disputes on the spot. Diaz himself wrote that he had never seen anything like it, not in Spain, not in Rome, not anywhere he'd traveled. And it's worth remembering this was a professional soldier who had actually seen major European and Mediterranean cities firsthand, not someone speaking from a place of total unfamiliarity with urban scale. Daily life in the city ran on a level of organization that extended well past markets and sanitation.
A dedicated police-like force maintained order throughout the city. Education was formalized and, notably, mandatory in a way most of contemporary Europe simply didn't practice. Aztec children across social classes attended structured schools called Telpochcali for commoners and Kalmikak for those training toward priesthood or higher administrative roles, receiving instruction in history, religious training, warfare, and civic responsibility. This wasn't universal literacy in the way we define it today, but it represented a level of structured, broadly accessible civic education that had no real parallel in most of Europe at the time, where formal schooling remained heavily restricted by class and almost entirely unavailable to the general population.
None of this is to suggest Aztec society was some kind of utopia. It was an empire, built substantially through military conquest of neighboring city-states, sustained by tribute extracted from subordinate populations, and organized around a religious system that included practices, most notably large-scale human sacrifice, that were genuinely brutal by any standard, ancient or modern, and that historians continue to study and contextualize without either minimizing or sensationalizing them. The point of this video isn't to romanticize Aztec civilization as flawless. It's to correct a much narrower, more specific historical distortion, the persistent assumption that European civilization in 1519 was inherently more urban, more organized, and more advanced than what it actually encountered in Mesoamerica. On nearly every concrete, measurable axis, population, sanitation infrastructure, water engineering, market organization, urban planning, the evidence points the other way.
So what happened to this city? Here, the story turns considerably darker and considerably more contested in its details, though not in its fundamental outcome. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived with a small Spanish force, and through a combination of alliances with indigenous groups who deeply resented Aztec imperial rule and tribute demands, genuine military technology advantages, and a devastating, unintentional biological factor, smallpox, introduced to a population with no prior immunity, and which killed an enormous and still debated proportion of the city's population in the years immediately following contact, the Aztec Empire's capital fell. The final siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was catastrophic, involving urban combat, deliberate destruction of infrastructure, and a death toll that some contemporary estimates place in the tens of thousands during the siege alone, on top of the smallpox deaths that preceded it. The city was systematically dismantled and largely built over in the years that followed, its temples and major structures demolished, with the stone frequently repurposed directly into the construction of the new Spanish colonial city rising in its place, the city that would eventually become Mexico City. For centuries, Tenochtitlan existed mostly as a written memory, described in colonial-era chronicles, until archaeological excavations in the 20th century, particularly the major excavation of the Templo Mayor beginning in 1978, began recovering physical evidence of the scale and sophistication that Spanish eyewitness accounts had described, but that had otherwise been buried, quite literally, beneath the modern capital. So here's the real shape of this story. In 1519, a European visitor arriving in the Aztec capital wasn't stepping into some lesser, more primitive world waiting to be civilized. By most measurable standards of the era, population, sanitation, water engineering, market organization, and urban planning, they were arriving somewhere more advanced than the city many of them had left behind. That fact was recorded in detail by the very soldiers who took part in destroying it, and then largely written out of the story that followed for the next 4 centuries. Understanding Tenochtitlan honestly doesn't require erasing the brutality of Aztec imperial rule, or ignoring the genuine complexity and cost of the conquest that followed. It requires holding both truths at once.
This was an empire capable of real cruelty, and it was also home to one of the most advanced cities on Earth at the moment Europeans arrived, a fact that got buried under the rubble just as thoroughly as the city itself.
If uncovering the parts of history that got literally paved over is exactly the kind of channel you want in your feed, make sure you're subscribed, because that's the entire point of what we do here. Hit like if this changed how you picture the world in 1519, and turn on notifications, because next week we're covering a story most people have never even heard existed, and you are not going to want to miss it.